Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. I got a viewer question the other day. A member of my channel reached out and said, hey, I've got a question for you. I'm really starting to enjoy using non-weighted soft plastics with heavier bait casting gear. They felt like there's a lot of advantages to bait casting gear with, say, your non-weighted or very lightly weighted soft stick baits, something like Berkley Max Scent the General or a Senko, and fishing it with your soft jerk baits like a fluke or similar style bait. And the reality is a lot of anglers are really starting to go towards heavier bait casting gear for these non-weighted or very lightly weighted soft plastics because they can throw it on heavier fishing line and they get a better hook set. And you know, if you're fishing, say, around some heavy pads down in Florida, or maybe you're flipping a general around docks up here in Wisconsin, a lot of times you just want that heavier setup to be able to get the fish out of there once you get them hooked. The problem with this is because you're using a bait that doesn't have much resistance in the water when you retrieve it back, you tend to get some loops in your line while you're retrieving it, and the line's going on the spool, and those loops and the fact that your line is not on the spool tightly is what causes a lot of backlashes down the road. So the viewer specifically asked me for ways I can help them to prevent that. So they asked me, you know, what are some of the ways to prevent getting backlashes and getting that loop to make sure that your line goes on tight while you're fishing these non-weighted soft plastics on bait casting gear. And I thought this was a good video to do because I think this is something that all of us deal with. You know, I run into this issue all the time, and it's not necessarily just with soft plastics, but maybe you're pitching a really light finesse jig on bait casting gear and you're just getting loops. It's just a function of the fact that you've got heavier tackle and you've got heavier line and you've got a bait that's not creating enough tension on your line to go on your spool on your bait casting reel smoothly. You know, this isn't an issue you run into when you're fishing like a deep diving crankbait, because the entire time you're retrieving that crankbait, there's enough tension on your line that it goes on your spool tight. And when you go to make the next cast, it comes off your spool very smoothly because it went on tight. If you're fishing a bait that does not have much weight or much tension when you're retrieving it, sometimes that line doesn't go on tight onto the spool and you get these little tiny loops that end up meaning when you go to make your next cast, it doesn't come off the spool smoothly, which limits your casting distance. It limits your casting accuracy because the line wants to catch on itself and it doesn't come through the guide smooth. There's a lot of issues with that. Not to mention, if you have these small loops in your line and you go to make a cast and you don't fix that loop, that's what will lead to a bigger backlash, which can potentially blow up your entire reel and mean you need the respooled fresh line. So it costs you a bunch of money. But I do have a bunch of things that you can do to help prevent these backlashes from occurring by fishing really light tackle. The first thing that I want to mention has to do with the line size that you're using. I think in a lot of instances, anglers who might be fishing a soft stick bait on, say, just an EWG style hook with no weight aren't necessarily downsizing their line. And what I mean by that is, you know, I think a lot of these bait casting setups are already rigged with, say, 20-pound fluorocarbon. I personally think the lighter you go, so maybe from 20, maybe you downsize to 15, you're going to have less memory in that line, which means it can go on your spool smoother and it takes less tension. So one tip would be to just downsize the line slightly. I'm not saying you got to go from 20-pound fluorocarbon down to 8-pound fluorocarbon. I think you could downsize to a 17 or 15, and each time you go down a little bit, you're going to see that line goes on your spool smoother because you don't have as much resistance from the line itself in terms of fighting your bait. So if you can downsize, that's a key. Another key would be to switch, if you're using monofilament or fluorocarbon, to switch over to a braid main line and use a fluorocarbon leader. The braid does not have the memory that you get with some of your fluorocarbon lines and your monofilament lines, and from that standpoint, it goes on your reel smoother with less tension. So you don't necessarily need to have that resistance from your bait to create the tension to go on your spool easily. Braid goes on your spool very easily, so you don't necessarily have to downsize, but you just should try using a braid backing or main line and then put on a leader to give you that same look that you were looking for if you're fishing fluorocarbon or monofilament. So those are two simple things that you can do. Another is to just pay very close attention to your bait while you're actually retrieving it. So in most instances, say I'm fishing docks, I'm gonna skip this under the dock with the bait caster, I'm gonna fish it around the dock, but I'm probably only working the bait for maybe a quarter of the cast at most, and then I'm retrieving it back. So if I skip the bait 50 feet out, I'm probably fishing it for 10 feet, and then I'm burning it back to the boat to try to make my next cast. Well, when I'm retrieving it quickly back to the boat to make my next cast, that's when your issues generally happen. And the reason for that is you're burning it so fast that your bait is skipping across the surface, and every time it skips, you lose that tension on your line, which means you have nothing keeping that line tight when it goes on the spool. So the faster you burn it back into the boat and the more it skips on the surface, the more you tend to have issues. So one, if you could slow down that retrieve back to the boat slightly, you're going to have maintained more resistance. Now, for somebody like myself, that's very hard to do. I don't want to retrieve it slower just to make sure it's going on my line better. But what you can do is retrieve your bait in a manner where your bait stays under the surface of the water longer, which gives you that tension, right? If you're pulling this bait underwater, you have resistance on your line. If your bait's skipping across the surface, you lose that. So I'll actually fire it out there and retrieve it with my rod tip down, which creates or prevents the bait from popping onto the surface. So I'll actually try to retrieve it back quick while the bait's under the water to maintain tension on my line, more tension on my line for longer. That definitely helps. You can even go as far as poking your rod tip under the water so your bait never comes out. You'll find that that actually makes a huge difference. It's just something you got to kind of train yourself to do and pay attention to that. Now, another thing some anglers will do, and this is something that really comes down to how you hold your reel. Some anglers will actually hold the line. So if I'm right-handed retrieving a reel, I'm going to hold higher up on the reel where I can actually like create tension on the line with my finger, either holding it or just kind of pushing on the line, which will create tension when it goes onto the spool. That's something you can do as well. I personally don't necessarily like that manner just based on how I hold my reels, but it is something you can go ahead and do and try. Now, if none of that works for you and you have a loop in your line, I highly suggest not continuing to fish normal with that loop. I always turn around. If I'm fishing, say I'm fishing this side, I'm going to turn around and whip a cast out just to pull that loop out. So I'm going to make a nice strong cast to pull out 60, 70 feet of line, which will pull the loops out. And then at that point, I'll generally, reel it back. And that's when I will pinch the line because I'm just burning it back to the boat. I want it to go on tight, and then I can turn around and go back fishing what I'm fishing. But it's a common problem that we all run into with bait casting gear anytime you're using a bait that is lighter than what you might normally use on that rod. So if you're using a medium heavy and you're throwing just a soft stick bait that doesn't have a weight, that's going to come in on the light end. It's probably I don't know, 1/8 of an ounce, right? That's light to be using on a medium heavy, but you still want the effects of that medium heavy rod. So you got to deal with it. And these are some tips that are just going to help you deal with it and prevent you from getting bigger backlashes that are going to be a huge headache. So hopefully it helps answer the question. These are things that I've been able to utilize to just help me be more efficient on the water, and hopefully it helps you guys as well. If you enjoyed today's video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned, we'll have a new video coming out tomorrow.